Okay, guys, so you know I love all the guests I have on my channel. I really do. But this next one's pretty high profile from my little dog and pony show here on YouTube. He's a distinguished and brilliant legal mind. I mean, he's been heavily referenced. Probably a half a dozen books on that shelf alone behind me have referenced his work, cited it, offered criticism. He was a friend of Justice Antonin Scalia, and I'm fairly familiar with his work. I've read a few things, and he doesn't just offer insights on legal proceedings in the United States, but he also has very sharp philosophical insights as well. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to be talking about freedom of speech, knowing how important that issue has become in this technological post-Trump age. So let's get right into it, guys. You're definitely going to want to watch this. Hey everyone, thanks so much as always for stopping by. I'm really excited to speak with today's guest. Stanley Fish is a New York Times best-selling author and frequent contributor. Aside from receiving numerous honors and awards for his work, there's really no frontier of academia that's completely foreign to the man. I mean, a Florsheimmer Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Cardozo, a Professor of Law at Florida International University, who's also taught at Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, Yale, Duke, and the University of Illinois, where he served as the dean there. Like, that's one hell of a resume. And today we're going to be discussing his most recent work on the First Amendment entitled The First, How to Think About Hate Speech, Campus Speech, Religious Speech, Fake News, Post-Truth, and Donald Trump. That subtext is about as long as your credentials. Professor Fish, I think what I enjoyed so much about this work was how it takes the reader right to the lip of an existential crisis, but then says, stop cleaving to concepts. The search for truth, be it legal, moral, academic, scientific, yeah, it's imperfect, but it works. Now, what do you think is the most widespread misunderstanding about freedom of speech doctrine or the First Amendment?
The most widespread misunderstanding of free speech doctrine is that the invocation of free speech is a relevant thing to do in any circumstance, not simply in the circumstance where the government is trying to restrict your speech, penalize you for it, or compelling you to produce speech that doesn't conform to what you really believe.
Yeah.
Those are very limited instances when that danger is imminent, and it is those moments that the free First Amendment can be legitimately invoked. But in other contexts in which you are interacting with your employer or or your employees, or with members of your family, or with clerks in a store, etc., any other everyday occurrence that might come to mind, you don't have free speech rights. Another way to put this is to answer a question that many people ask, which is, well, what is free speech for? What is the First Amendment for? Why do we have it? And there are a number of standard answers to that question, all of which are useful and powerful in their way. Free speech facilitates the search for truth. Free speech allows the production of an informed citizenry who will then have enough information on which to base firm conclusions. Or free speech is what enables dissent to occur even when there is a very powerful and dominant political constituency. All of those are good reasons or good answers to the question, what is free speech for? But what you have to realize is that anytime you give one of those answers, you have implicitly endorsed censorship. Because, for example, if you say free speech facilitates the search for truth, you will have to acknowledge that some forms of speech don't do that at all. They, in fact, obstruct the search for truth, or wish to stop the search for truth, or overwhelm the search for truth with irrelevancies and deceptions. And when you find those forms of speech, if you want to be true to the First Amendment goal of seeking and realizing the truth, you're going to have to limit and therefore censor those forms of speech which undermine the goal. So again, Free speech can only be understood against a background of necessary censorship.
Yeah.
Free speech rights only pertain to those situations in which the government is attempting to control and penalize or ventriloquize your speech.
Yeah. You brought up something fascinating in chapter one, talking about the Hyde Park corner. Something I thought would be interesting to hear your opinion on is you seem to allude in there that under certain conditions, the Hyde Park corner would actually render language unintelligible,
Right.
taken to its furthest extent. How is that?
Well, it would render it, I'm not so sure I'd use the word unintelligible. I would say inconsequential.
Inconsequential, yeah.
And in a Hyde Park corner situation where speakers just get up and say whatever they like, and someone else gets up and says whatever he or she likes, and people come and go around the fringes and are generally amused by what is being said, but are not particularly deeply engaged with it. In contexts like that, the production of speech is surely occurring, but it's
Mhm.
not. But it's not serious. Just venting and is the equivalent in some way of the production of noise.
I believe this polarity thinking, as opposed to binary thinking, is the subtle beauty throughout this entire book. Like opposites depend upon each other for their creation. Difference is identity, as the old saw goes, right? The great
Right.
challenge when thinking about speech is understanding that it's not just a descriptive enterprise, like, the chair is red, the microphone is black. Speech is implicitly performative too. And that's an odd idea at first, but how is speech performative?
Well, this is something, of course, that was known and broadcast by the uh, uh, Greek and Roman rhetoricians, who in many ways wrote the book
Mhm.
on all of this, although their work is not as well known as it should be to people who debate these issues in our contemporary situation. The discipline of rhetoric was a massive, for instance, Quintilian's rhetoric has 12 books. The discipline of rhetoric was a massive compilation of the ends to which speech could be put. And it's not prescriptive.
Mhm.
It doesn't. The rhetoricians don't tell you what to say or what positions to take. The rhetoricians tell you that if you want to bring about this effect, whatever it might be, if you want to perform the effect, to be performative, here are some techniques that you can use. And what the rhetoricians recognize is that the production of speech in a social or political situation is a community building enterprise. Because what you're trying to do is bring others around to your point of view. And if others are brought around to your point of view in sufficient number, then lo and behold, you have a community of believers and agreeers, and who therefore are placed strategically in the world of politics or economics or agriculture or education or whatever it might be. So you have to regard speech as profoundly performative. It brings about events in the world rather than merely reporting on them or reflecting or mirroring them. So
Yeah.
speech can powerfully, in a sense, create the referent to which it subsequently refers. And that's and for a lot of people, and it's a common sense version, the world comes first. Speech about the world comes second and can be then evaluated as either accurate or inaccurate. But what I'm suggesting, and of course I'm not the only one, this has been said for centuries by many people, is that the words come first, the world follows. And that, as an utterance, especially in a form as naked as the one that I just deliver, will seem both counterintuitive and terrifying to many people.
Stop right there. Hold up. All right, peeps, so I'm just going to interrupt for a second right here. I want to show you something. You see that ratio? Look at that. 86%. 86 freaking percent of you watching are not subscribed. Why don't you like me? What are you even doing anyways? So the next time we see this little animation, what are we gonna do? Damn straight. Okay, I hate to have to set you straight like that, but it's for your own good. I don't want to have this conversation again, you understand? Anyways, as I was saying. Well, that was one of the most profound things about your earlier work, which I had read a couple years ago, Winning Arguments. And the centerfold quote from that is, arguments about the world come first, the world comes second, words make the world. And we underestimate just how powerful that is, because we think of words as just, it implicitly refers to other things, like it saves us having to carry a backpack and pull out items whenever we're trying to communicate with each other and say, this is what I'm talking about. Right. But there are other speech devices which are, you mentioned self-referential, and even Wittgenstein said that it doesn't have materiality, even reference other than what's in itself. Like, how would you have a much better way of saying it? Maybe I should just get you to kind of encapsulate what I'm saying there.
Let me pick up on something that you alluded to, which is Jonathan Swift's little fable in I believe, the third book of Gulliver's Travels, where he comes upon a world in which there is a very strong distrust of language because of all the capacities language has for distortion, deception, exaggeration. So these people have dealt with this defect of language by supposedly speaking only with the things to which language refers, and therefore speaking only with the things bypasses the verbal realm and avoids the dangers of the verbal realm. So he imagines two people, two citizens of this country who meet on the street, and if they're going to have a conversation, they each has to reach into this very large backpack and pull out the things to which they are referring, which of course means they're not referring to them. They're right there. And isn't that the ideal communication situation? Well, it's not. And it won't even work on that level. Because if you pull out two things, you've just pulled out two things. But if you want to suggest a relationship between them, cause and effect, contiguity, prominence, precedence, etc., you then have to begin to use some kind of symbolic system, i.e. some kind of language. So you're never going to get to the desired point, the point desired by those who wish we could do away with words and just talk about the nitty-gritty without any intervention. You're never going to get to that. And instead, you're always immediately going to be involved in the building of language structures. And the building of language structures is necessarily selective. You can't say everything. You can't describe. And therefore, there's always more that's going to be left out than what is included. And it will be correct to say that, quote unquote, reality has been distorted by language. But there is no other option except perhaps the option of becoming silent for one's life, never speaking. There's a reason why in some Christian traditions especially, one of the highest orders of being is occupied by those hermits who never speak, except internally in their prayers and petitions to God. Because if you never speak, you never have to risk the dangers that come along with speech, of deceiving, of being deceived, of lying, of being the victim of lies, of being intimidated or being an intimidator, You don't have to, and none of that any longer applies. But of course, at that moment, you don't have anything like a civilization or a community. Uh,
Yeah. So what do you want, right? Take
right,
your
right.
pick.
Now, let's put it this way. I think it makes perfect sense for a tradition like the tradition of Christianity to value highly that hermit figure, uh,
Sure.
that acolyte who can live without communicating and just live silently in some kind of relationship with deity. But would you want everyone to be that way? You could not have everyone be that way and have anything like a world.
So we accept then that speech has this creative function in it. It has this creative property, if you will. And even
Yes.
the law has a category for that in terms of speech acts, speech
Mhm.
possessing no verbal content, and incitement, which is another kind of um, under the ambit of speech that is action. But here's a really huge issue I want to run by you. You even allude to this in the first chapter. Why is I'm going to mention a few instances here. Why is flag burning, protesting the discriminatory use of no loitering bylaws, trespassing in the form of tent cities, ganja gatherings, even Kathy Griffin holding up a bust of Donald Trump's decapitated head? Why are all those behaviors considered speech? But when a Jehovah's Witness calls a town marshal a racketeer and a damned fascist for preventing his ministry, it's considered fighting words or an action under law.
Well, I think that the distinctions that you've just given us are the result of political circumstances, not the result of anything philosophically coherent that can be said about the doctrine of free speech. Take flag burning as an example. There was a dissent to Texas v. Johnson, several dissents to Texas v. Johnson in 1986. And one of the dissents, I think, was offered by Justice Rehnquist, who said that burning the flag is speech of no kind. It's just the equivalent of an inarticulate grunt, is what he said. Whereas the majority says no, burning a flag is an expressive act and therefore is to be protected under the doctrine of the First Amendment. The question you immediately want to ask, at least the one I want to ask, well, how many acts can be described or characterized as expressive? And the answer to that question is any act at all
Mm-hmm.
that has ever been performed in the history of humankind. So if you take the doctrine of expressive speech very seriously, then no action will be punishable or held liable because it will have been successfully characterized as speech. But no one wants that kind of society. We all want a society in which some actions are regarded as permissible and others deserve to have the heavy hand of the state fall on them. The problem is that people in different political constituencies will have very different views of which actions fall on which side of that line. So there's always an attempt, and it might succeed at some time, to reinvigorate the flag burning question and to make something like flag burning, in fact, not protected by the First Amendment. I myself would be in favor of that. I
Mm-hmm.
think that Texas v. Johnson was wrongly decided. And I recently had a conversation with Mr. Johnson, the person who was first convicted and then, shall we say, unconvicted by the Supreme Court.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he now goes around the country, of course, preaching or not preaching, yes, the free speech doctrine, which in his case led to his conviction being overturned. But these are close calls. When someone sleeps in a public park against the rule that is posted at the entry of the park, is he or she speaking if he or she considers the protest a way of contesting the very regulation that is now being used against him or against her. And you can go both ways with that. You can say, yeah, but, and that's really the answer. Suppose, and then you get the yeah, but is when this is, of course, the kind of hypotheticals that law schools love.
Mm.
Okay, 4 or 5 hippies, if there are any hippies left in this world, 4 or 5 hippies go to sleep in the park. There's a rule against sleeping in the park, but enforcing it is probably going to be more trouble than it's worth. How about 4 or 5 hippies turns into 60 or 100 hippies? They're still expressing themselves, aren't they? But the state suddenly becomes much more nervous at the intrusion of a mass of people that large, which again goes to the point I made originally in response to your question. All of these questions, all are and debates are political questions and debates.
Well, and I want to start veering over into hate speech, but just one more
Right.
question before we do that. Uh, how has the First Amendment been weaponized in recent decades?
Well, the First Amendment has been weaponized in recent decades by ignoring the distinction with which our conversation began. That is, by ignoring the distinction between the First Amendment as a legal constitutional doctrine and the idea that, on one side, and the idea that we should all be free to speak as we like. So both conservatives and liberals have decided that when one of their own is taken off a platform or not invited to speak on a campus, then his or her free speech rights have been violated. And I think this development is very unhappy development, but I don't see that it is going to wane or decrease in the near future. So it becomes easier and easier to invoke free speech and the violation supposedly of your free speech rights in almost any situation and to be taken seriously. A great First Amendment scholar by the name of Frederick Schauer at the University of Virginia uh, termed this strategy free speech opportunism,
Yeah.
which he meant if you're in a position where you want to be allowed to do something that the law says you can't do, or you want to avoid punishment for something you've already done, just attach your grievance or your claim to free speech, and you're likely to be in a better position than you were before. That's the way it is now in the world. So that students think, for example, some students think that they have free speech rights in the classroom. That is, if they want to put forward a point of view or raise a question about the material being taught, they have every right to do so. And if the instructor says to the student, no, that's not a point that we're going to discuss here, or that's an interesting point, but it doesn't belong in this class, or that's an interesting point, but it's a political one, not an academic one, and we're here to do academic business. Students who hear things like that feel that their free speech rights have been violated.
Yeah.
And I'll say flatly, students have no free speech rights at all. They're students.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm going to read something that you wrote because you perfectly encapsulated the issue here. You say, when one says freedom of speech, the reference seems solid enough, but
Yeah.
it melts at the analytical touch. There's nothing fixed about free speech doctrine at all. It's a grab bag of analogies, invented for the occasion arguments, rhetorical slogans, shaky distinctions, and ad hoc exceptions to those very distinctions, all combining to make it an artifact of the very politics it's supposed to transcend. The First Amendment is a participant in the partisan battle, a prize in the political wars, and not an apolitical oasis of principle. That's the first thesis. The second thesis is that there's nothing wrong with that. And so I think that that sums up the problem of, philosophically speaking, of speech. Now, going right into hate speech, chapter 2 is entitled Why Hate Speech Cannot Be Defined. Why is it not possible to identify hate speech consistently?
Because you would have to identify assertions and assertions that had content, not simply noise. You would have to identify assertions, a set of assertions that was universally regarded as abhorrent or hateful.
Mm.
And you're never going to do that. So to take an example that I use in the book, the Westboro Baptist Church members participate in the verbal harassment of mourners at the funerals of young American soldiers. And they hold up placards saying that the death of this and other soldiers is the result of God's anger at us for being a society too hospitable to homosexuals and lesbians. Now, a lot of people believe that that is hateful speech, not only in terms of its content, but in terms of the pain it inflicts on the parents who are burying their young son. And I can only imagine
Oh,
what kind of pain that must be. Now, is what they say hate speech? You have to ask the question from their point of view. Did the members of the Westboro Church, most of whom are lawyers, did the members of the Westboro Church get up in the morning and say, today I'm going to produce some hate speech at the grave of this soldier? No. They get up and say, today I'm going to go out and speak some truths that godless America needs to hear. What you have to begin with is the assumption of the sincerity of people who produce what you or I or someone else might consider hate speech. A definition of hate speech could only be achieved if there were, as I said before, a universal agreement as to what the contents of that category are. And you're never going to get a universal agreement. And the Westboro Baptist Church example, I think, shows clearly why you're not.
yeah, and yet in saying that, you're not implying that we should just go the whole hog and say, ergo, all speech is permissible then. You're not
No,
saying
but
that.
no, but again, I'm going to return to my usual theme. Restrictions on speech of some kinds and the permission of other kinds of speech to flourish will always be a political decision. So
Mhm.
it's always going to be a calculation engaged in by the people who for the moment have political power. Questions will be asked like, what effects does this form of speech have? Do we believe that these effects are deleterious? Do we believe that the world would be better and our society would be more healthy if these forms of speech were not present? And then the next question, well, what are the consequences of trying to regulate this form of speech? Will those consequences themselves be such that the cost of doing so may be greater than the cost of allowing the speech to flourish? All of those are practical political questions. And those, I think, are the appropriate questions to put when you're thinking of regulating or censoring a form of speech. Not philosophical questions like, well, what is the nature of speech or what is the nature of hate or anything like that, because you're never going to get any answers to
Hmm.
those questions.
Here's a line that ended up in my quote tote. It was so good. You wrote, if we want to be faithful to the values of free speech, sorry, the values free speech supports, values like the search for truth and the democratization of political debate, we must on occasion curtail speech deemed to be subversive of those same values.
Right.
This is an insight Europeans and Canadians embrace, while Americans have traditionally pushed it away. Well, I'm unapologetically among that camp who's a proponent of this more European view. American exceptionalists feel differently, though. They say that their constitution is superior because you
Right,
can have
right.
things like Holocaust denial. But wouldn't it sounds in that quote that you don't agree with the American exceptionalists? It's a logical incompatibility to have all speech permissible, even the kinds of hate speech we can define.
Yes, and actually, this is a basic problem with liberalism, the form of government under which we live. Not liberalism in the sense of a political party position, but rather classical liberalism as it has come down to us from the writings of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Immanuel Kant, and in our century, preeminently, the philosopher John Rawls.
Mm.
Now, in that system of liberalism, the supposed legitimization of all forms of speech encounters a problem when some of the forms of speech that offer themselves in the marketplace are designed to undo and undermine the very liberal structure that gives them permission. What do you do then?
Yeah.
Well, there are two answers to that question. One answer was given by Justice Holmes in a case early in the 20th century, when he said that, well, if the words of a dictatorship are destined to sway the country and that particular form of dictatorship will be installed in the country, the First Amendment says they must have their chance and perhaps may have their way. That's not an exact quote, but that's what Holmes said. So that's what I call the fatalistic reading of the First Amendment and of liberalism. You just have to court the danger and accept the danger that the very permissiveness or tolerance that is a part of the structure of liberalism could lead to the undoing of that structure. Then there's another kind of answer to this paradox, and that's the answer given by Justice Brandeis in the late 20s and early 30s, where he said two things, and they go together. He said, one, sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Yes.
That is, if you allow bad ideas out into the air, the public will soon see them for what they are and reject them. And the second quotation, which is another version of the first, is the remedy for bad speech is more speech, not enforced silence. So again, together, what Brandeis is saying, let the marketplace of ideas work, and its workings will in time deliver the desired result, which will be the recognition of good speech and the banishment or disavowal of bad speech. And what I say at that point in the chapter is that the only counter argument to what Brandeis says is all of recorded history. All of recorded history tells us that when speech is allowed freely to circulate, its effect will be amplified,
Yeah.
not diminished. People who have never heard about Holocaust denial suddenly listen to it, and it relates to something in their lives. They were fired by some Jewish merchant,
Yeah.
and they've been resenting this for years, and finally they are given a way of thinking about the world, which justifies their outrage and supports the accusation that they were unfairly treated. So let enough Holocaust denial material get into the airways or into the internet, and the result would be more converts and adherents.
Do you think, and I highly doubt it would ever come to this, but if this ever did see the Supreme Court, how would the justices interpret, for example, Donald Trump's baseless accusations of election fraud, or Senator Mo Brooks, just before the insurrection, saying, "Start taking down names and kicking some ass"? How would the Supreme Court interpret those words?
Well, the Supreme Court would interpret the words just as the um, lawyers and commentators on both sides of the political divide interpreted them. It would be a debate between what are known as textualists
Yep.
and intentionalists. And those are two categories of legal interpretation that have been developed in the last 40 or 50 years. The textualists will say, as some of Trump's defenders did say, look, the word remove is central to the text describing impeachment. And you cannot logically, therefore, bring a case of impeachment against someone who has already been removed.
Yeah.
So there the emphasis would be on the text, and the argument would be solely on the basis of that word. The intentionalists said, no, what you have to do is keep in mind the reason that the framers included an impeachment provision in the Constitution. What were they thinking of? What kind of danger did they want to avoid? What kind of good did they want to advance? Would they have wanted it to be the case that someone could escape impeachment by performing high crimes and misdemeanors in the last week or two of his or her tenure? No, those intentionalists say that couldn't have been what was on their mind. Well, in the Supreme Court, the members of the Supreme Court, some of them will be intentionalists, some of them will be textualists. And so you'll get the same argument over and over again. And exactly who wins the argument will depend upon the political structure of the court at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see Scalia just rolling in his grave right now at this most recent developments. Because he
In what
was
way? In what way do you
well,
think
he was, at least as far as my understanding, is that he was a textualist, and
Yes, he was the textualist, Mr.
he wrote the book on it really. Whereas
Yeah, he did.
you take someone like Ginsburg, who's more of an intentionalist, or uh, of course, there's other segments of this too, like originalism and things like that.
Well, yeah, well, originalism actually is a blanket, is an umbrella concept which covers both intentionalism and textualism. Yes, I
Yeah.
think you're right about Scalia, who was a really great man
Oh,
uh,
he's wonderful.
in many ways, and someone I knew. Uh, and he would probably agree with the textualist argument. And he would probably also say something, you may wish that the framers had worded this differently in a way that allowed the trial of a president who is no longer president. But that's not what they in fact said. And therefore, there is no warrant in constitutional law for the action you wish to perform. He probably would have argued that way. I suspect that on the current court, Gorsuch, who is a very strong intentionalist, would argue that way, as would Alito. And I don't know about the newest justice of the Supreme Court, but I think that she too considers herself a student of Scalia's. Justice Roberts has been on both sides. Justice Roberts turned into an intentionalist in the case that upheld the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And so we would have to see how the court was composed at the moment that this case that you hypothetically imagine came before it.
Yeah, it's I have sort of this boxing matches of all the justices going on in my mind, just imagining this, and it likely won't happen. I mean, the Supreme Court would probably just hand it down to lower courts or whatever, anyways, even if it did uh, see the light of day in a court of law. I'm going to switch gears again. I think we should move on to campus speech.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned earlier how students don't have freedom of speech.
Right.
Here's how you frame it in your book. You say, you won't find a campus landscape chock full of free speech controversies. All you will find are disputes about professional boundaries and administrative responsibilities dressed up as disputes about freedom of speech. Can you explain that?
Yes, I think that, first of all, I wanted to say something about the way in which university administrators, a generally hapless lot of people,
Yeah.
deal with these measures. University administrators, not all of them, but many of them, don't realize that they're not in the free speech business, that they have no obligation whatsoever to respond to free speech claims. Rather, they are in the education business, and the education business can be defined in terms of the materials that one wants to teach and the lessons that one hopes students will take away, and the requirements for degrees and everything else that makes up a university. Free speech, as I put it, is not an academic value. That is, it's not the case that when a student stands up and wants to say something in class, or when a professor wishes to use the classroom for an elaboration of his or her political views, it's not the case that a free speech issue has been has emerged. A disciplinary, professional, institutional issue has emerged. Does the university wish to become a platform for the rehearsal of its employees' political views? The answer is no, it doesn't. Does it have to allow those views? No, it doesn't. All it has to do is invoke its mission and say, in effect, that's not the kind of thing we do around here.
Yeah.
And the same with instructors who don't want to follow a lesson plan in a multi-section course, don't like the text that the department shows, don't like the succession of readings and want to go out on their own. Well, one understands that desire, but there's no free speech issue involved. Maybe they can petition the administration for an exception, and maybe not. But if they lose their petition, they have no First Amendment recourse. So this leads me to say, in general, that there are very few free speech issues on campus, even though free speech issues on campus supposedly are occurring all the time if we listen to our commentators and read our newspapers.
Yeah. Yeah. And how much struggle would the academic, um, deans and so on save themselves if they simply understood that. There was
Mhm.
one thing kind of unclear to me in that section of campus speech, and I'm going to lay it out for you here.
Sure.
I completely appreciate how, it's generally about professionalism and in administrative roles. The university should never be a political actor, despite being partly and sometimes totally funded by the public.
Absolutely right.
However, now here's where it gets a little tricky in my mind, and I don't know if you answered this in the book. Being that they, like corporations, must appeal to the free market in recruiting students,
Right.
I'm not sure how they could remain perfectly ambivalent when professors like the one you brought up in your book, James Tracy, who engaged in a very high profile Twitter dispute with the parents of a Sandy Hook massacre victim, even to the
Right.
point of demanding proof that their son Noah actually existed and they are who they purported themselves to be in the media. How can a university not get involved when they have an image and market concerns in much the way that corporations do?
Well, you're right, of course, that universities have market and image concerns, but the moment that they allow those concerns sway, they have forfeited their right to be called themselves universities. They have turned from being educational institutions into being frankly political actors. Now, the only way I think that one can counter the bad press that may follow from any decision to hold the line that I have been drawing is to go to the public and explain things and to be very firm. Administrators should be firm in defending the university enterprise and what it stands for. They should say loudly and publicly. And if they all did that all the time, they might be at least a partial return to the days 40, 50, 75 years ago when university administrators, deans, and chancellors and presidents were among the most respected individuals in our country. But now they're not, because they have allowed themselves to become the site or location of various contesting political interests and constituencies. And they spend a lot of their time responding to those constituencies or trying to mollify some and cotton up to others. They shouldn't be doing any of those things, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't be fundraising, because that's part of their position. They should be fundraising because it's a necessary part of maintaining the enterprise, of keeping it going. But they should understand what again, I'm not the only one who is saying this, have said about the mission of the university, the educational mission of the university, which must always be put in the forefront. Now, of course, there are some things that a college or university can do with respect to local, state, and even national constituencies that are legitimate. Suppose you are a university and you decide that you're going to open up not so much a college or perhaps a quasi-college that allows members of the public to come in and take, let's say, short 2 or 3 week courses from highly respected academics. And the university is going to bear the cost of this enterprise because it thinks quite rightly that the yield will be a better image of what it does in the public mind. That's perfectly legitimate to do things of an educational kind, which have as their goal gaining the support of members of the public. But that's quite different from just caving in to public pressures, whether they come from legislators or parents or donors or students, for that matter.
Yeah. Have you found yourself embroiled in this dispute when you acted in the capacity of dean at the Chicago of Illinois?
No, I did not, but that was back in 1999 to 2004 or 5. The only time when I recall an issue like this arising was when there was a conference shortly after the declaration of war on Iraq, which would have been 2003, I guess. And there was a conference called in which the situation and its implications were going to be discussed. And that's perfectly legitimate, to discuss political questions as opposed to offering yourself as a forum for deciding political questions. One of the flyers that went out advertising this conference had a sentence in it that I missed, but the chairperson of women's studies pointed it out to me. And it said in an independent clause, now that we are fighting a racist war, comma. Well, I don't care what happens after the comma.
Yeah.
The university was putting out a statement in the form of a flyer paid for by university funds, which declared the university's position on a contested political question. What kind of war is this? Is it a racist war? Is it a war necessary for the preservation of liberal democracy, etc.? Those are questions that could be debated at a conference such as the one that was being called. But they're not questions that should be decided, or it seemed to have been decided by a phrase in a flyer put out by the university. But that's the close. There was one. No, that was the closest I came to a situation like that. But I was lucky. I mean, sure, if I'd been in another, I might. I'm sure that today I might not have escaped so easily.
Well, the way you put it in your book, I think you would have hauled a very understandable line. It made crystal clear sense to me.
There's also the question of what's called extracurricular speech on the part of faculty members.
Hmm.
Faculty members who speak out not while they're in class or on the campus, but by writing an op-ed in the newspaper or writing a letter to the editor, or sending out some tweet on a private server, not on the university server. And this comes to the attention of members of the university community, attention of legislators, attention of parents, who become outraged at what is said. What then is the proper course of action for an administrator to take? Well, the proper course of action for an administrator to take is very simple. You say that person is a private citizen. In his capacity as a private citizen, as opposed to when he is acting in his capacity as a professor in our classroom, in his or her capacity as a private citizen, he or she has First Amendment rights, and it will not be any part of this administration's act to punish him or her for exercising those rights. That's the clean position. Almost no administrator I know can stop there, because the second step that administrators will take will say, but of course I abhor these views.
They can't help themselves.
Please don't associate my office or the university in general with those horrible things that Professor X has said. They don't see that standing up for the citizen free speech rights of their faculty in one moment and condemning what the faculty said in the next moment, is, shall we say, a contradiction.
Yeah, just slightly, hey?
They just don't see it. They just don't see it. They have to prove their virtue, as opposed to understanding their professional position and the obligations it brings along with it.
Okay, well, we're going to do another pivot here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to get around to post-truth. You have some amazing things to say on that. What kind of complications often figure prominently in First Amendment deliberations concerning religious speech?
Well, the burden of my chapter on religious speech is to say that the religion clause doesn't belong in the First Amendment, or doesn't belong in the Constitution, because the religion clause does something that liberalism at its heart warns against, and that is either privileging a form of speech, giving it a special capacity or value, or degrading and demonizing a form of speech. You're not supposed to do either of those things, according to liberal doctrine. With respect to the freedom of religion issues, the First Amendment religion clause does both things. The First Amendment religious clause, in its free exercise clause, says members of our citizenry who are inspired to religious acts, even if those acts are in violation of generally applicable law, will get a pass. And on the other hand, the Establishment Clause says, don't let religious speech enter into the political conversation, because that will tend toward an establishing of religion by the state. So the Free Exercise Clause privileges religious speech. The Establishment Clause casts it under a shadow of suspicion. And not only are these two impulses contradictory to one another, that is, you can't reconcile the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, although many legal scholars have attempted to do so, but also neither of the clauses fits with a constitution whose first principle is the equality of discourses and the equal accessibility of all speakers to the microphone or platform. But there it is. Once you have this horribly contorted religion clause, which shouldn't even be there in the first place, you're going to have a case history history of cases in which these contradictions are played out over and over again without any hope of resolution. And it's all going to be again a political. It's going to be a political question as to which of the two clauses is in ascendancy at a. Are people more afraid of religious speech, and so they'll be invoking the Establishment Clause, or do they want to protect and encourage religious speech, in which case they'll be proponents of the Free Exercise Clause? Right now, ever since, let's say about 1993 or 4, with the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, as it's known. Since the passage of RFRA, the pendulum has swung in the direction of the Free Exercise Clause, so that we have all of these cases where bakers and florists, for example, decline to supply their goods or services to same-sex marriages because they say our religion holds those marriages as sinful, and I don't want to be complicit in sin. So you have the free exercise claim, which says, I don't care what the anti-discrimination laws of this state say, I am not going to be coerced into violating my religious views. And lower courts in general have sided with the state and said, no, the anti-discrimination policies trump an individual's personal religious preferences. And it's something, in fact, that Scalia said in 1990 in the Oregon peyote case. But I think that the cases that have recently emerged, starting with Hosanna Tabor, which is a case that expands what is called the ministerial exception, and then going to a series of other cases, these cases tend to land on the side of the free exercise clause. And I would predict in the court as it's now constituted that the free exercise of religion is going to become more and more stronger and stronger and stronger, and that we will therefore be in the position that Scalia feared we might be in when he said that if you allow individual religious preferences to trump generally applicable law, then you don't have a system of law. You just have a situation in which everyone, if he or she is religious, has the right to determine which laws to obey and which laws to disobey.
Yeah,
That's
well,
where we are.
yeah, sorry to interrupt. And that was one of the things that I respected so much about Scalia is, you know, he wasn't without his nuance. It was just,
Oh, no.
like the man was very intelligent. And even though people like to write him off, like Al Franken like to write him off as just this right-wing crazy lunatic or whatever on the bench, it wasn't that way at all. He had the
No,
capacity to see the liberal argument in this. Not liberal, but you know what I mean. You
the
know,
progressive.
whereas a conservative would shamelessly take up the mantle of religious free exercise, right? And in that case, Scalia was able to see that no, this could actually present an issue, as you just mentioned. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Now, I was going to say that, yes, Scalia has a very nuanced view of many of these matters. And the votes that he took that were so criticized, let's say, on gay marriage issues, were taken, he said, not because of any animus he held toward gay persons.
Yeah,
It's because he said he believed that issues like this should be decided by legislatures and not by the court. It's democratic deliberation, not,
exactly.
not judicial fiat, he said, that should determine these important and contested questions. And that was a position that he held quite consistently in many cases.
And you can disagree with it, but you have to respect it on some level too, right?
Absolutely. And besides, he was by far the best writer that the Supreme Court has ever produced.
We could spend forever on religion. Trust me, this has been so interesting. But I want to move on to post-truth because you are a busy man. Um, Now, yeah, okay. So the final thing is fake news and the post-truth dilemma we've all become sensitive to in the Trump era. I think you have the most interesting explanation I've read on this phenomenon of fake news. You seem to blame it on a techno-utopian culture
That's
centered
right.
on a very narrow definition of transparency. So how do you get from one to the other there?
Well, transparency is the doctrine that we would be better off if we received our information directly, rather than receiving it through filters, gatekeepers, and curators. So the idea is that just put all the information out there, and it will, in effect, tell us the truth without having the truth pre-selected by editors or experts or newspapers. Okay, that's the transparency ideal. The more information, the more data, the better. The truth, which I suggested, which I hinted toward when we were discussing Holocaust denial a while ago, the truth is that the more information that is uncurated and unfiltered there is, the less possibility there is that anyone will know how to distinguish the useful from the useless, the true from the false. That
Yeah.
is absent the guidance of gatekeepers, curators, and filters. All you have is this huge and ever proliferating mass of data and no way to make your way through it intelligently, because that way has been sacrificed along with the supposed elimination of gatekeepers and experts. However, this is a very good situation for trolls and internet predators,
Mm-hmm.
because if they have this huge body of data, as I said a moment ago, ever proliferating, then it's the case, and that it hasn't been ordered and configured in any way, then it's the case that you, that is the troll or predator, can order and configure it in any manner you please, and then craft a narrative or an image or a set of images that serves whatever nefarious ends that you may have. In short, very condition of transparency is what makes the possibility of fake news so powerful and successful and prevalent. So that's why the title of that chapter,
Oh,
Mother of Fake News. Uh, and the reason that fake news is such a problem is that because when you are an apostle of transparency, you are necessarily suspicious of received authorities of the kind that have been doing the filtering and the gatekeeping. That is, you cast suspicion on the newspaper of record, or on the census, or on the expertise of scientists and medical personnel, or on the Census Bureau, or on great libraries, all of which used to be thought, or on the network news productions of the major networks, ABC, NBC,
yeah.
and CBS. All of those in previous generations were the repositories of a kind of trust that people could invoke and rely on. Not because that everything of these institutions produced or offered was true, but that you had confidence in the fact that they were trying to get it right.
Yeah.
Now, the erosion of confidence in these institutions goes along, as I've already said, with the doctrine or the gospel, and it is a gospel, of transparency. And when that happens, you're suddenly in a position where anyone can say to anyone else, "Well, that's just what you say," and you can't say, "No, I read it in the New York Times," or it was authoritatively stated in a book published by the Harvard University Press,
Yeah.
or this is what a group of hundreds of historians have in fact established through painstaking research and data. You say all of those things, and you're going to be met with a corrosive distrust of those very persons and institutions. And it's a very bad situation.
Oh, it is. And you have a very persuasive anecdote actually that you resort to on occasion about Walter Cronkite.
Oh, yes,
Could I ask you just to tell that because it's
sure.
powerful? Yeah.
Walter Cronkite used to sign off saying that's the way it is. Uh, and he was the CBS news anchor for many years. And he was the most trusted man in America. Interestingly, someone without a college education. So he was the most trusted man, not because, again, every word that he ever uttered while he was in anger turned out to be true and accurate, because everybody knew that he was trying to
Yeah.
be true and accurate, and trying as hard as any human being possibly could. There is no such comparable figure today.
No, it's
There is
gone.
no such comparable figure today, or such a comparable institution. Whether this will change now that a populist president is no longer in office, I don't know. But if it does change, it will not change overnight. The building up of trust in our institutions, or at least in some of them, may be a long time coming.
I think this is a good way to segue into post-truth then. What
Sure.
is the post-truth predicament?
The post-truth predicament is not really a new predicament.
Hmm.
The post-truth predicament is that there are no foundational vantage points from which truth can be absolutely and objectively measured and stated. But this is not, of course, a new situation. There never have been any objectively transcendent viewpoints from which the truth can be spied. So the fact that we are now, some people say we're now in a post-truth condition. We've always been in a
Yeah.
post-truth condition. But the bulwark that prevented us from falling into despair or the throwing up of our hands is, again, those institutions, man-made, but nevertheless reliable more of the time than not, that helped us to continue, to keep on going, to do work, to assess that work, to propose solutions to our problems for the future. So post-truth condition, again, something that we have always occupied. What we have not always occupied is a situation in which the repository of trust in the institutions that we ourselves have fashioned is eroded and lost. So
Yeah.
the post-truth answers to the post-truth question and to the fake news question turn out to be pretty much the same.
Yeah, yeah. You've been criticized in the past as a postmodernist, and while you espouse certain things written by Foucault and Derrida, what would distinguish you from postmodernism? Because I read on Wikipedia that you do disavow postmodernism. Is that
Well, it
correct?
depends. I mean, for many people, postmodernism or deconstruction or uh, post-structuralism, these are not simply arguments about the status of knowledge, but rather they are recipes for living. Now, an argument about the status of knowledge is an epistemological argument. That is, it's an argument about, well, where do we get our knowledge from? How firm is the source of that knowledge? How do we determine in the midst of competing assertions which is more true or more reliable, et cetera, et cetera? Those are all epistemological questions to which there are some postmodernist answers, and they are generally anti-foundationalist answers, as I have described them in our interview. Then you want to say, okay, you have been persuaded to postmodernism in the sense that you would now give postmodern-like answers to those epistemological questions. What follows then in terms of your action as a political person, or even as a family person, or as a business person? And my answer is nothing whatsoever. The fact that you hold a philosophical position with respect to traditional questions in philosophy tells you nothing about tells no one anything about how you would perform in situations which were not philosophy seminars, but which instead were practical, political, familial, and mercantile situations. So insofar as there are some postmodernists who believe that holding a postmodernist view therefore inclines you to this or that political position, that's false.
Yeah.
Holding a postmodern view inclines you to nothing at all, except the next time these questions, epistemological questions, come up, you'll give postmodern answers rather than the answers that you might have given some years ago. So postmodernism, another way to put this, postmodernism is a position in philosophy, and as a position in philosophy, it doesn't have any effects whatsoever. Although right now, a lot of people blame postmodernism for the woke culture in our campus, for the cancel culture that has spread beyond our campus, and for the proliferation of fake news. I think that's a misidentification of the source. No philosophical position could ever have that kind of power. And again, you could be a postmodernist in the morning, in the sense that you've taught a course, as I have, in the text of Derrida and others, and explain the postmodernist position. And then in the afternoon, you could go out and vote for Donald Trump, or vote for regulations against same-sex marriage, although you no longer can do that because now we have a constitutional position. But I
Right.
make the point that way to illustrate the lack of a relationship between the views that you hold in a philosophic discussion and the way you will behave once you leave that discussion.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of anti-foundationalism and some of these things that we're talking about, deconstruction, which should be um, distinct from destruction, it's
Oh, yeah.
deconstruction. In doing this on my channel, I've been called a postmodernist, and I just don't know where this label has taken on such a kind of like a swear word quality, like
Sure. Well,
because
it's like the label socialist that's been
yeah,
uh,
exactly.
bandied around in the last election. That the if you if you are arguing for a single payer medical plan, you're a socialist.
Yeah.
Uh, and if you are, and so if you are casting doubt on something that a lot of people have faith in, you are postmodernist. It's just a word that is trotted out something that's turned into a club to beat you with.
Yeah, I was a longtime admirer of Jordan Peterson. Well, still am to some degree. I do like the guy. But something that has really begun to turn me off is how he'd rail against the relativism, the relativizing elements of what he calls postmodern identitarian activism. But then he had always pulled this maneuver again and again by saying the left is terrible for their collectivism, citing, progressive bias on campuses. It's such an irritating circularity because that's a collectivist conclusion to the very core. Whenever taken up on this contradiction, he squirrels around it, insisting that the mainstream left has become radical. Yet your views on anti-foundationalism actually escape the nihilist implications of post-truthism. Can you explain how anti-foundationalism's recognition of how truth is always contextual, provisional, can you explain how that, in fact, delivers you from the regressive circularity in today's political climate?
Because it turns you, and again, this is going to be the same answer over again. It turns you back in the direction of those institutions that we have developed and fashioned in ways that allow us to move on, continue to imagine projects and try to implement them. So you're no longer looking for a single answer, a totalizing truth, a magic word. You're back down there in the nitty gritty, trying to make things happen. That's what postmodernism preaches, if it preaches anything. You're not going to find the answers in some invariant, objective, universal realm. So don't look for the answers there. Go back to what we've always been doing and try to improve the conditions of the enterprises and institutions we inhabit. it's the furthest away from a relativizing argument
Yeah.
that you can go. Relativism is only a philosophy that has force at the highest level of philosophical reasoning. That is, you could argue that there's no invariant objective way to decide between what are finally incommensurable points of view. But no one, neither you nor I, ever occupies the position of having to decide between incommensurable points of view. We are always and already ensconced within some set of views in which we have a degree of trust, and which, of course, can be altered in time. So the relativist sphere exists only in the philosophy department and nowhere else.
Yeah. Well, one final question before I let you go. Thank you so much for your time. My final question, and I only ask it just because this name always spikes the YouTube algorithm. What are your thoughts on Jordan Peterson?
I don't have, remind me who he is again.
Well, he's kind of celebrated as the most recognized Western intellectual going right now. Uh,
I thought I was that.
Well, yeah, of course, just after you. No, and I mean, he does have some good things, you know. He talks, he's a Jungian, and you know, I guess his main thing is about striving uphill and accepting your suffering, and yeah, so he's just gotten so much attention, and especially since his medical problems, you know. Involving benzodiazepines. And so I'm just curious if you had any
No, I'm
opinions on
sorry.
that.
I must fail you here.
That's
I
okay.
know I read something about him a while ago, and I realized that he had some kind of presence, media and cultural presence, but I never quite understood what the attraction was, or what was it that he was offering. Could you quickly say what it is that he's offering?
Well, there's a lot of things. I think he was offering a much more balanced view of conservatism than is traditionally characterized in the media. He is a very intelligent person. Uh, and I would say he defers back to the value of religion in society, which I don't have a problem with that.
Neither
Uh,
do
yeah, it plays a very good role, you know. And I think that, you know, in the light of new atheism gaining so much traction, it's been a nice counterforce. But I think he's allowed a space, and this is where Sam and Harris and I might agree, is he's allowed a space for Trumpism to flourish, in my opinion, uh, and post-truthism to just take off. And as you mentioned, this is the reality we live in anyway. It's a philosophical problem. But there's no reason to throw away the institutions and to throw away
no,
your grasp on reality. And
no.
he's a real postmodernism basher too. And I wondered where that comes from, because on the one hand, he totally espouses deconstruction. He thinks that, yeah, we need to get at our fundamental assumptions and see what's propping that up. You know, so yeah, there's a lot of things. I could talk a lot about Jordan Peterson because I've researched him a lot. But yeah, I was just more or less interested in how
I'm
you
sorry.
thought. That's okay. That's okay.
I just can't rise to this moment.
It's gossipy anyways. It's gossipy. So I really appreciate your time, Professor. And for those of you watching, make sure you get this bloody book in your hands because it's amazing. I'll have links to it in the description below. And while you're at it, can't hurt. Buy that one too because it's very one of my favorite books actually. Both of these are. Um, Stanley, is there anything else you'd like to plug to my audience? Maybe a website, promotion, your socials, or anything like that before we say goodbye?
No, I don't have a website. I don't have a website. I'm not on Facebook. No, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to discuss these matters with you, and I thank you for your questions.
Well, thank you very much, good sir, and I hope that I can have you back maybe when you release your next one or something.
Okay,
Okay.
that will be on law at the movies.
Law
That's
at
what,
the.
that's what
Sorry, I
I'm
don't
writing.
understand.
I'm writing a book about movies that are law centered.
Oh,
That have
oh,
law.
That's an interesting topic. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to it. Have a good night there, sir. Thank you very much.
You too.
Okay, bye now. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. We put up some incredibly transformative content on this channel. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.